port, the oil seaport, that's for exporting oil. You see, Ras Lanuf, that's the biggest in Libya here.
And Brega, further east, also still seems to be out of Gaddafi's control. Two things are becoming clear. First of all is that increasingly the fighting's being concentrated around oil towns, which it's hardly surprising Gaddafi's so keen to reclaim, while his assets are being seized all over Europe. His forces are also keen to destroy arms dumps in the hands of rebels. This one went up in flames in Benghazi, although it's not clear how. More than a dozen were killed, the funerals demonstrating once again how united Benghazi is against the government in Tripoli. The other development is that it's clear the fighting's becoming harder, and all the reports from the frontline towns suggest more people being killed than in previous days. The main reason why the two sides are so deadlocked is because neither is particularly strong. But all the same, it's hardly surprising the words civil war are beginning to appear more frequently to describe what's happening in Libya. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Well, correspondent Hoda Abdelhamid is live for us in Benghazi. Hoda, I know that you've just recently returned from Ras Lanuf. Tell us about the protesters there and why they're now on the move heading towards Sirte, which is certainly going to be a very big fight on their hands.
Certainly it is, and actually at the moment they're regrouping on the outskirts of Ras Lanuf towards Sirte. They say that they have to regroup, they have to just reassess what capabilities they have before moving on. We did get some information that they actually moved a bit further later this afternoon to a place called Ben Jawad. That's another small town about 40 to 50 kilometers after Ras Lanuf. But certainly that is, they're piercing through all these towns is, I think, is much easier than what is ahead, because these towns are quite small, they're very little populated, and it's quite easy to go through them, and they do have the support of the people there. Now, once they continue in Sirte, it's going to be a completely different story, because in Sirte you have a mixture of people who do support Gaddafi. Those are the people of his own tribe, but I think we should say the branch of his own tribe, and then you have other tribes there who have shown signs that they would actually follow the rebels and the protesters. Now, from what I've seen on the road, it's really army-led at this stage. The commanders who have deserted their chain of command in Tripoli are now leading these mixture of soldiers and volunteers. They do have a lot of weapons, and you have to bear in mind that each time a town falls, well, then they get more weapons. So they do feel emboldened, but they do realize that they're much more difficult. What's coming ahead is much more difficult than what's happening now.
And the fighting is intensifying around these big oil towns like Ras Lanuf and Brega. You've talked about the protesters being fairly well armed, but how organised are they? What kind of command structure do they have?
Well, I think that's one of their biggest challenge at the moment. The military commanders are trying to take the lead here, but they do say that a lot of these volunteers are completely disorganized. They're very excited. Some of them have never held a weapon in their hands before, but they have the will and they have the resilience that they want to go. Whoever you speak to will tell you, we're going to Sirte, we're marching to Tripoli, and then they specify we're marching to AlJazeera, which is considered the stronghold, really, of where Gaddafi and his closest allies or his families are holed up at the moment. But it is a challenge for the military commanders who are trying to give this force some sort of structure and organization. Certainly they are emboldened. Certainly they do feel support from the people who come and give them also a lot of sort of intelligence of what's happening around in the villages away from the main roads, etc. But it is definitely a challenge, and it will become more difficult as they go ahead.
Hoda, good to talk to you as ever. Thanks very much indeed for that. Hoda Abdelhamid in Benghazi there. Now, while much of the oil industry, as we've been hearing, is in the hands of Libya's opposition, revenues from the sale of oil to Europe are still going to Tripoli. Let's get more on the impact of that from Felicity Barr in our London News Centre. Felicity.
Thanks, Sheila. Yes, you're right. Whereas America's sanctions prohibit money being paid to the Libyan central bank, those imposed by other countries don't. And critics say that means that oil money is continuing to prop up the Gaddafi government. Rory Challens has more.
Oil. Libya has it. The rest of the world needs it. Under the hot, dry desert sands lies the source of 95% of the country's export earnings. As the Libyan government cracks down on protesters, the international community is trying to push Colonel Gaddafi's financial pressure points. But this British newspaper says the oil trade is still pumping millions of dollars into the country and potentially into the hands of Gaddafi's regime.
Is the money from the central bank being used for the good of Libya, for the citizens and for his economy, or is being used as the pocket money from the Gaddafi family to do whatever they are doing right now in Libya? That's a big question mark that no one can answer. But at the moment, the sanctions in Europe are only targeting individuals, so like the family of Muammar Gaddafi, and they are not targeting institutions such as the central bank.
The web of international sanctions brought down on the Libyan government has plenty of gaps in it. AlJazeera understands businesses from China, India and Austria are still buying Libyan oil completely legally. That's not to say the violence isn't hurting the government's pockets, though.
A lot of the foreign oil companies have pulled their staff out. These staff are essential for the operations that are taking place there. So while production is continuing just now at much reduced levels, in the long term, this is not sustainable.
Libya's oil fields, like the ones in the Sirte Basin, El Bouri and El Hamra, provide Colonel Gaddafi's regime with 80% of its revenue. In 2010, exports were about 1.3 million barrels a day. Last week, that had slumped to under 600,000 barrels a day, and it's still falling. But despite Libya's financial vulnerability, there's been little international talk of an oil embargo. There's scant desire for action which might push oil prices higher, regardless of how many Libyan lives that oil money may cost. Rory Challens, AlJazeera.
And with me now is Samuel Chishuk. He is Senior Middle East Analyst with the IHS Global Insight. Samuel, how surprising is it that Libya is still receiving, the Libyan government that is still receiving money from the sale of oil given the sanctions?
Well, to be honest, it's not really surprising at all because, firstly, the oil deals themselves, generally term contracts, would have been signed a while ago and will be rolling contracts. Secondly, before you actually set up new payment mechanisms or anything like that, money will just continue to go into the account which exists, and that will still, it appears, be controlled by the central bank.
So is it difficult then? Are you saying it's difficult to actually... I mean, they're not trying to get out of the contracts because obviously they still want the contracts and people around the world still want the Libyan oil, but you're saying it's actually difficult for the individual companies themselves to make a money transfer, to change the way they pay?
Well, I mean, it depends on what we mean with difficult. It would be difficult for the opposition, for instance, to take control of their part of the oil financially very quickly. This is something that might happen and might, take some time. In the meanwhile, we have deals that were struck before sanctions, really, and which are continuing, and I suppose, and I think pretty much everybody expects, are right now being wound up. But there's always a lag with these things, and before we